Welcome, everyone. We are excited to have you all here for hopefully a scintillating conversation about kind of where we stand in Vadnais Heights as far as economic development, redevelopment. We've invited the Urban Land Institute of Minnesota to put a panel of experts to speak to us and what they did a little research and found, and I turn it over to Gordon Hughes, who has kind of been our point person and lead on this.
Well, thanks again for hosting us tonight. If you allow me to do a brief infomercial about ULI Minnesota, we're a district council of the Urban Land Institute, which is a worldwide nonprofit research and education organization that is supported by our members and our sponsors. The mission at ULI is to provide leadership in the use of land and in creating thriving communities worldwide. We were founded in 1936, have over 40,000 members worldwide. Our mission at ULI Minnesota is grounded in developing, nurturing, and expanding relationships to make our region more prosperous and sustainable. How do we accomplish that? It's largely because of the work of the Regional Council of Mayors, which we've supported since 2004. Since then, participation in the RCM has grown from 8 mayors to now 55 mayors. They meet every month. They meet voluntarily. There's no bylaws. There's no membership dues. They get together over lunch to talk about regional issues in a nonpartisan setting. And it's a wonderful group, and we would encourage your mayor to stop by and take a look and hopefully participate in it as time permits. Well, during the past 5 years or so, we've facilitated workshops like this in over 50 Minnesota cities, thanks to the support of Minnesota Housing and the Family Housing Fund. Our focus in those workshops has been to help cities contend with the changes brought about by the Great Recession and societal and preference changes of our society, the new normal, so to speak. Tonight, we hope that we'll delve a little bit deeper in talking about navigating your competitive future, things that you can do to secure the best possible development and redevelopment for Vadnais Heights. Our workshops divided into 4 parts. I'll give an overview of some national and statewide trends that are affecting cities. Then Kathy will zero in on some demographic data and workforce data relative to Vadnais Heights and do some comparisons with the places that you compare yourself to. And then we'll turn to our panel. Our panel had what we call a pregame meeting with your staff a couple weeks ago to learn a bit more about the city, and they're prepared to respond to some questions that we'll pose to them. And then lastly, we'll have an interactive discussion with you. But I want to stress that the line between part 3 and 4 blurs, and we let it blur. So we have found that the most valuable part of the workshop is the conversation that you can have with the panel. And to the extent that you would like to weigh in sooner than later, please do. Don't wait for the end of the meeting to do that. So, by way of background, our country and region, we believe, are being influenced by 4 major change drivers: demographics, market forces, technology, and the resiliency of our public infrastructure. And let's spend some time looking at each of these. First, for demographics, our makeup is influenced these days by the size and characteristics of our different generations, our aging population, and our cultural diversity. Although boomers continue to dominate Minnesota's population, the millennials, or Gen Y, those that were born between 1979 and 1985, are catching up and passing us boomers as the largest single generation in the U.S. Although they have some distinct differences in their worldviews, they also share some strong opinions about what makes a great neighborhood and a great community. As a whole, the U.S. is aging, and Minnesota skews slightly older than the national average. This is a combination of people living longer and the decline in household size that began in the late 70s. On a statewide basis, we're getting older faster. Between 2010 and 2030, the number of adults age 65 and older is expected to nearly double, while the number of younger residents will increase only modestly. And around 2020, the Minnesota's 65 plus population is expected to surpass the K-12 population for the first time. That will have a major impact on our economy, workforce, housing, healthcare system, you name it, it will be impacted. The rapid aging of our population will result in a profound increase in households occupied by us older folks. Meanwhile, households occupied by those under 65 will remain relatively flat. According to the Metropolitan Council, about 85% of household growth in the next 15 years will be in 1 and 2 person households occupied by people 65 years of age or older, which is a stark turnaround from the household growth in the past. And actually, this is a hard one to believe, but it actually may mean that our region's current supply of single-family homes, single-family detached homes, may be enough to satisfy the region's needs for the next 20 years or more. Hard to believe, but that's what some of the numbers look like. Minnesota is becoming more culturally diverse, and as a result, communities will be asked to navigate a greater array of cultural needs and desires. By 2035, about 35% of the Twin Cities population will comprise communities of color. Immigrants are making up an increasing portion of our population, although Minnesota again lags a bit behind the U.S. as a whole. According to research from Kauffman, foreign-born Americans are twice as likely to start a business as native-born Americans, thus making civic engagement for that group a key area of focus. Minnesota's communities of color lag behind their neighbors in many areas, including poverty rate, home ownership rate, education, as well as housing costs, where 44% are paying more than 30% of their income on housing. Market forces, a number of market forces are at work shaping our region, most notably the type of housing and neighborhoods preferred by different generations, the impact of housing costs on our residents, and the mismatch between housing and jobs and the growing shortage of a trained workforce. Why is this important? In a recent survey conducted by Greater MSP, they asked recent young transplants to the region what they look for in choosing a community to live. Overwhelmingly, the number one attribute was the availability and affordability of housing. Proximity to work, mobility, connectivity, parks and green space also entered in as top priorities, but affordable housing was number one. All Gen Yers live downtown, right? Well, not really. Most see themselves as suburbanites. Most see themselves as small town folks. Interestingly, though, our opinion is Gen Yers seem to be looking for more urban amenities within the suburbs and small towns they call home. I have an example of that in my house. I have two daughters right in the middle of Gen Y-dom. One's 29, the other's 31. Until recently, one of them lived with her husband on the 18th floor of a 54-story apartment in Wrigleyville in Chicago. The other, with her husband and kids, lives in the most typical suburban environment you can imagine in Woodbury. So I asked my daughter from Chicago, what do you like about living in Chicago? And she says, well, Dad, we're so close to everything. There's so close to shopping. We're so close to parks. There's trails everywhere. We can walk everywhere. We can bike everywhere. I asked my daughter in Woodbury, what do you like about Woodbury? She said, Dad, we're so close to everything. We're so close to shopping. We're so close to trails. We're so close to biking. We can walk everywhere, and we have a park right next door. So while they lived in very different environments, they still seem to be looking for the same thing in the neighborhoods and in the city that they live in. Again, getting back to millennials, while they're personally hopeful about their future, the overwhelming majority of Americans today think it's harder for young people to achieve a secure middle-class lifestyle than it used to be. Things such as retirement, home ownership, stable, decent paying jobs, affordable housing, less likely than it was a generation ago. A couple weeks ago, I was on the annual fishing trip with family and friends. One of the young people is a pharmacist, a couple years out of South Dakota State, has a good job. He astounded us by saying his student debt was $190,000, and he and his wife are paying about $1,600 a month on debt service for student loans. Of course, us old people were shocked at the numbers, but clearly the result is delaying, home ownership, delaying the start of families. He was just a microcosm of the things we were talking about that were so impactful to younger people right now. And of course, as on a countrywide basis, income and wealth gap between Americans' highest earners and the rest of the population has continued to expand, and I suspect will continue to expand in the future. The number of cost-burdened households, those paying more than 30% of their income towards housing, has grown to comprise almost 1/2 of all households in our metro area, many of whom are living below the poverty level. Most are working, though. About 69% of households living in poverty have at least one working member. Minnesota and our region have fared better than any other parts of the country in rebounding from the Great Recession. However, a large portion of the job growth in the region has been at wages that struggle to meet housing needs in areas where the jobs are located. As a result, there's a growing mismatch between where lower wage workers are employed and where they can find housing they can afford. About 50% of the jobs in greater MSP pay less than needed to afford most two-bedroom apartments in the region. Over the next few years, regional businesses may struggle to find talented and qualified employees. The workforce shortage could become one of the most important factors in business expansion and business location decisions. And according to Greater NSP, our region remains challenging to recruit for. We rank 19th out of 25th U.S. metro regions in attracting talent. But the good news is once they're here, we keep them. We rank first in our ability to retain people once they decide to brave our winters. E-commerce has changed the face of retailing, not just for Minnesota, but nationwide, where it counts for almost $1.2 trillion. The total retail market is growing by an average of 15% annually since the Great Recession. By contrast, the construction of new retail space has dropped precipitously during and after the recession and has not recovered to pre-recession levels. Many consider the U.S. to be overstored, meaning that many retailers have more stores than they need and can sustainably support, which means that those retail centers that are succeeding are covering a larger trade area than they have in the past. And I suspect John may be able to comment more specifically on that during our panel discussion. Technology. Automation may be the flip side of the shortage of a qualified workforce. Research suggests that up to 47% of American jobs may be automated over the next couple of decades. Automation of tasks can often free workers up to do more intensive or creative work. It's also possible that decreased cost of production will make it economical to return manufacturing to the U.S., but probably not at the great paying jobs or with the great paying jobs of the past. Technology is enabling new kinds of services that are changing and challenging existing models and how people spend their money. I admit when we did this overhead, I think I recognized one of the names on here. One of my older panelists, John's partner, mentioned that I'm still looking for Ben Franklin and Woolworths on these logos, and they're not there. The speed with which technology makes it possible for people to get what they want means access is becoming more important than outright ownership. As one of my younger colleagues at ULI has mentioned, just because I want a hole in the wall doesn't mean I want to own the drill. And I've let him know that I have lots of power tools in case he needs those sorts of things. Some technologies such as driverless cars, 3D printing, drone delivery will affect cities more than others. Autonomous vehicles could dramatically shift how people get around, how many cars they own, if any, and street and parking design for cities. Whether you believe that driverless cars will be here in 5 years or in 25 years, a point that we're trying to stress is the infrastructure decisions that you're making today, whether they be street design, parking ramp design, parking lot design, will likely have a lifespan longer than even the most pessimistic forecast for transforming our fleet. So even if these things are a long way off, our belief is they're coming and you will be affected by it, especially in the infrastructure decisions that you're making. We're also getting at the beginning of the Internet of Things, a state of widespread connectivity between people, structures, and gadgets. Monitors, trackers of all kinds are getting smaller and cheaper, and we're beginning to put them on everything: heating and cooling systems, energy, water use, building occupancy, you name it, which will have great implications on those of us that are charged with overseeing the infrastructure of our communities. Resiliency has become an important responsibility of our communities. Changing technology and growing interconnectedness means that more and more parts of our environment are at risk of being compromised, and communities of all sizes need to think about their own strategy for cybersecurity of their infrastructure. Apparently, we are under cyber attack now by somebody as we speak. And although the water outage up in Blaine that happened earlier this year was not security related, it shows how vulnerable these sorts of systems are, especially those that are controlled by some of the newer technologies. When I started with the city, running the water system was turning a big valve. Now it's, it's something else, again, that certainly exposes us to lots of issues. The size and specifications of warehouse facilities have grown substantially to accommodate the needs for distribution centers. When I started with the city, 24-foot ceilings were pretty state-of-the-art for warehouses. They're not anymore. And as the needs for these facilities have changed, many cities are left with outdated buildings with unclear futures. Instead of simply hoping for redevelopment, some communities have embraced new ways to use these older structures, such as maker spaces, which are business incubators, which give fledgling companies an inexpensive space to grow and mature without the burdens of ownership or rental. By providing some centralized services as well, business coaching and guidance, they can open doors to new businesses and innovations in your community. Planning and paying for infrastructure upkeep has always been costly to cities and likely to consume even more resources in the future. In older communities, roads, water, sewer infrastructure are reaching the end of their useful life, and financial resources available in the past may not be available today for their upkeep. How many of us, I know you are, from the city engineering standpoint, getting sick of the 100-year flood that happens every few years. Every month. Overloaded, under-designed storm sewers are examples of the struggles that we all face trying to be resilient cities in the next century. So now, before we move into the panel, I think we'll shift to Kathy, and she'll share some focused community change data relative to Vadnais Heights. And then we're going to pause for a minute and use that as a time to perhaps answer questions on some of the data that we've thrown at you before we get into the panel. Kathy.
Great, thanks, Gordon. So as Gordon mentioned, I'm just going to provide you with some demographic information about your workers, your labor force, etc. This may be data that you already know, particularly if you're starting to go through your comprehensive planning process. That is probably information you're starting to collect. So it's really kind of draws back to the national and local trends that Gordon provides, and to provide the panelists with a little bit of context on your city here in Vadnais Heights. So with that, I'm going to start with a demographic change between 2000 up to 2010 to 2015. With about 13,000, close to 13,000 in total population, Vadnais Heights population declined during 2000 to 2010. It's not uncommon with other first-ring suburbs that did see a decline over that period of time, or very flat growth. But it has rebounded for about a 5% growth between 2010 and 2015. Breaking this down, I think the growth tells a little bit of a different story, kind of tracks with some of the demographic trends that Gordon talked about. 25% of the population is middle-aged, that's those 35 to 54, and they declined from 2010 to 2015. Many of them likely aged into the next category. We call that aging in place. And that category, those 55 to 74, grew by 10%. So it's likely that the decline also precipitated to the increase in that age group. Looking at your oldest population, those 75 and over, they only make up about 9% of the population, but as you can see, they grew significantly. So your population is aging and potentially staying here, or if you've had some senior housing developments, maybe that has contributed to that as well. While those under the age of 15 grew slightly, those age 15 to 24 declined the most by 17%. That's kind of that Gen Y age. Actually, that's before the Gen Y age. That's the age, I don't know what they call them.
MTV calls it the Founders Generation.
Gen Z.
When I was watching
Gen
the other
Z
night.
or Gen
Yeah,
Z. I've heard Gen Z, but
yeah.
the founders, I haven't heard that.
Well, those of us who watch MTV,
Yeah,
Does that still exist?
yeah, right.
of course. So,
The Gen Y group, actually, those with the age between 15 and 34, they comprise about 14% of your population, and they grew by 19%. That's really positive. That is the age group that is putting down roots in your community, that maybe is in a rental situation or maybe bought their first home here, but those are the ones that are going to be looking at where they're going to call home for a longer period of time, and those are the age group that as they stay here and age in place, they're going to be buying those other homes that the age groups older than them maybe are going to be trying to sell. So
that's somewhat unusual for the cities that we've studied.
particularly for first-ring suburbs, we're seeing that more and more. But a 19% growth is a pretty sizable growth. I mean, I think we see in the outer ring suburbs that's maybe declining, and in the first-ring suburbs we're seeing that age group grow a little bit. So, which if you looked at the ages or the time frame between 2000 and 2010, that wasn't the case. So I think that age group is wanting to stay closer to the urban core, closer to job growth, closer to amenities, walkability, etc. Whoops. Okay. So where and in what types of homes are your residents living? About 80% are homeowners and about 18% are renters, with about a 2% vacancy. And I would say that's pretty low for a vacancy rate overall. Typical that we've seen is about 4 to 5%. So you may have a need for more supply in your community. Broken down by type of home, regardless of ownership and rental, the majority, 53%, live in a single-family detached home, 26% in multifamily attached, 18% in apartments, and about 3% live in a manufactured home. Everybody likes to compare themselves to somebody else, and so we took some communities that are surrounding you or that are similar to Vandus Heights, and you're most similar in your 10-year breakdown with Arden Hills. Now, they may shift over the next 20 years based upon a large development opportunity that they have in their community. Other cities like Fridley has a lot more rental housing, and Little Canada, etc. The value of housing and rent levels has an impact on the local market, as well as its ability to attract that new and future residents to find homes in your city. The majority of ownership housing stock is affordable, with about 49% of the housing having a value under $200,000. Vandus Heights gross rent is also relatively affordable, with 51% of the gross rent in the city under $1,000 per month. So it seems like you have some distribution of value options. However, when you look at the affordability related to typical area median income levels. Vandus Heights, there's a limited affordable options, only about 12% available for those within the lower income ranges of 50% of the area median income or below. That's about $42,500 salary for a family of four, and they can afford typically mostly less than about $1,000 a month in housing costs. 85% of the households have an income over 80% of the area median income. There's also a growing number of cost burden residents, both owning and renting homes in the city. About 6% of Vandus Heights population is below the poverty level. That's about making an annual salary of about $25,000 per year. The poverty rate grew from about 3% in 2000, and I would say that every single city that we have done a workshop in, the poverty rate has increased, and usually about double. If some are even more significantly than that. Also breaking this information down by households and if they are cost burdened, and if they're renters or owners. That's the chart on the right. This indicates that about 23% of the Vandus Heights households are cost burdened, meaning they pay about 30% or more of their household income on housing costs. 67% of those are homeowners and about 33% are renters. I'm sorry, these numbers are wrong. Let's see. That's right. And then looking at those who are severely cost burdened, and those are households that are pay more than 50% of their income on housing costs. About 8% in Vandus Heights are severely cost burdened, and the majority of them are owners. So it's meaning that people are paying more for their housing than maybe they should be. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're low income. It just means that they're putting more of their household income into housing costs. So I'm going to shift a little bit to the employment in the city relative to the community's resiliency. What is your labor force, and where are your residents working, and what are the wages in the community? This chart is a breakdown of the industries by employment sectors in Vandus Heights. In 2015, there was an estimated 9,100 total jobs in the city. 30% of the jobs are in manufacturing and construction, and 15% in retail trade, and you can see from there it decreases from there. The city of Vandus Heights is considered a net importer of job, meaning that there are more jobs in the city, that's the dark green circle, than residents working, that's the light green circle. Approximately 4% of the labor force is both living and working in the city, and the average is about 15%, so there's a little bit of a mismatch there. And then we look at where your residents work and where the companies that are in Vandus Heights get their workers from. This pie chart is the labor pool, so the number of jobs in the city and where their employees come from, with about 4% of those jobs held by residents. Other locations that your employers get their workers from, about 15% from Minneapolis and St. Paul, 20% from suburban Ramsey County, 16% from Washington County, and about 14% from Anoka County. And then this chart shows where your workers, your residents work. With about 6,700 Vandus Heights residents working, it can be assumed, looking at this information, that about 90% of them commute outside of the city for work. 31% commute to Minneapolis and St. Paul, 29% to suburban Ramsey County, 13% to suburban Hennepin County. And being that your location is fairly close to Minneapolis and St. Paul, that's not surprising. And my final slide is just kind of taking a comparison look at the average annual wages paid by your employers in the city related to the residents' median household income, and comparing it to the county, the metro overall, and then I just took Fridley as an example, as a like community. I would say Vandus Heights employers tend to offer a similar average wage compared to the county and the region overall, less than the companies in Fridley. This could be reflective of the top industry sectors being construction and manufacturing and retail. They potentially pay a lower wage rate. However, the residents tend to have a higher median income than the region overall and the county and Fridley, maybe indicating the need for some lower cost housing for those employers so the residents can live here, or an opportunity to attract some higher paying jobs for the residents so that they do not need to commute. So with that, we're going to move into the panel discussion, but I just want to leave you with one of the key findings that we have found through these workshops, is that it's really important to have a long-term vision and a strategy and tools for your community to attract the best development. And we've left with you at the table. I'm not getting this thing to move anymore.
Yeah, they said the battery was kind of in and out.
Which is
so.
fine. I have one last slide, but it's really about the 10 principles that we think are really important, and I have a handout at your table that kind of outlines them as well. So, great.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. Let's pause for a minute. Before we move into the panel, anything that we've thrown at you so far that you have questions on or would like any further explanation on before we jump in? Yes, sir.
If you were to sum it all up, overall health grade would be we're seriously ill, or we're in the middle of the pack, or what? Boil it down for me.
Well, I think the panel will kind of lend that to some specificity around market, but I think as far as demographics are concerned, I think you're healthy in regards that you're able to be able to attract and retain some of that younger generation. I think the growth in the senior population maybe something that you might want to focus on, but that is probably the couple of things that I would say. Your median household income is strong.
Great city. You don't, there's not a red flag I think when we look at this data compared to the data we look at in the other 50-some cities we've done workshops on. You have a lot to be proud of here. Nothing that's a real big red flag at all. So, but we'll talk a bit about markets and other things when we get into the panel.
And we're talking about this with the comprehensive plan. We're collecting this information. We just had a business council meeting on a lot of this demographic and economic information. And we'll compile all that, and they alluded to some of it, but what does the data tell us? And how does that inform policy moving forward? So that's really a key piece that we're going to zero in on the comprehensive plan too. And that's what brings value to that document. The data can change, but at this point in time we're collecting it. What does it tell us for the future? So, and how do we craft policy around that to get a vision that we want for the community? So this is a great first step in sort of laying the groundwork for what we're going to be building on for the comprehensive planning process.
Okay, let's start. John, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay, because we just talked a little bit about market. In your view, where does Vandus Heights fit in to the metro area marketplace? What sorts of things are possible here, especially when we look at retailing, dining, office, those sorts of things?
Well, so in all of our suburban communities, and really across the whole metropolitan area, I've been in the shopping center business for 35 years, and I think I might have built my last one. The overall footprint of the retail business is shrinking, but the story's a lot more interesting than that. A lot of the work that we're doing in that space now is looking at so the change that we're experiencing is very much a double-edged sword. On one side we've got obsolescence and dislocation and facilities that are that appear to be underutilized. On the other, we have demand for new products that don't really exist in sufficient quantity. So a lot of my work these days is looking at the shrinking footprint of retail and figuring out how to repurpose a lot of those facilities. I mean, we're doing things that we would have never done even 10 years ago, putting in lots of non-retail uses, from housing to medical office to civic and other things. You know, I think that when I think about commercial, and their other footprint that is shrinking is office space. We're occupying less space, we're working in more places, we're more mobile. But I think, you know, when you think about commercial, there are kind of four things that people in your community really care about. One is convenience. It's sort of a quality of life thing to have shopping available close to where you live. One is service. There are a whole range of services that are very difficult to deliver in a truck or over a wire. And we're starting to see a pretty big shift in our shopping center tendency from, you know, retail goods to much more personal services. So that's an opportunity. I think there's still something that, you know, and even some of the e-commerce giants, I mean, gosh, we saw Amazon, you know, a week or two ago buy Whole Foods. There's something about a curated experience that's important both for a buyer and a seller, and that may not that's evolving pretty rapidly. But the physical bricks and mortar presence is still an important channel. It's just going to be different. And then the last thing that we're really seeing is that, and actually there's a very good example of this in your community. We've looked in a really granular way at how properties are performing, and you know, I was sort of brought up to think that, you know, you take a particular type of property in a particular geography, sort of expect that, you know, Class B suburban apartments, you know, you'd sort of expect to see the performance of those properties on a classic bell curve. If there would be outliers, and it would be a pretty good reason why, but most would revert to the mean. In our commercial space, we're seeing the exact opposite thing happen. It's now referred to it as a saddle curve. So we divided the pool up into quartiles. The first quartile, the highest performing, would still be the largest one, but the second largest one is going to be properties that are really performing poorly. And even within a particular trade area, we start to see that. So there are some characteristics that are becoming more and more important. The importance of place, really, and placemaking. And I was just peripherally involved, just a tiny little bit, in the some work that happened in one of your suburban shopping centers, and it was a very modest intervention. That, you know, I think it was Festival Foods that left, and the property owner, you know, really was very thoughtful about adding, you know, cafe space and creating a place that was more inviting for people to gather. So I don't see probably a need for a lot of new commercial space, and I would pay really careful attention to what you have so that it continues to be an asset and it's leveraged.
What about things, especially things like restaurants? Every city that we do a workshop in, there seems to be a common theme of why can't we get fill in the blank restaurant or this sort of restaurant? Is the same thing happening in the restaurant industry? Is it relating again back to place and
I think so.
Specialty things?
You know, and every community is a little bit different. I mean, food service is actually one of the most dynamic and most interesting spaces in the commercial market. And there's a lot of innovation there. You know, it's always been a business where there's a fair amount of turnover. So it's really just a question of figuring out what the community can support. And, you know, it's going to be, you know, very different here than it is in the North Loop of Minneapolis. So it's just really a matter of figuring out, you know, what the the threshold is to support those things. But that's a very active space, and I'm still active in a number of environments, some, very dense urban and some, classically suburban, and there's activity in both.
Is it also, is it like all retailing? Is it a shrinking footprint in dining, or is it more complicated than that for dining?
I think that it must be more complicated. I don't have a quick answer to that. But I think, again, there are places people want to be, and wherever you have opportunities to integrate outdoor dining, to cluster restaurants that are similar but different enough so that people have some variety. Placemaking is just critical, and that's a both a real challenge and an opportunity in mature suburbs. What we were building when these places were being built is not exactly what the market wants today. So, but there's opportunity.
One of the things that we didn't talk about this, so I hope I'm not throwing you too big a curve here. And Joni might comment on this too, is ULI convened a national panel earlier this year about how to attract creative class and whatnot. And one of the things that came out of it is, especially with young people, acutely sensitive to the difference between authentic and inauthentic places. And how can cities sort of look at those authentic places that the public sees as authentic and capitalize on? Are you seeing that in retailing too?
I mean, to me, that's the whole thing about place. I mean, I have probably 50 data sets from different places where I've either invested or done a workout. I've spent a lot of my time fixing problems in my career, right? That's probably the big theme. And if there's one thing that jumps out at me, I mean, it's always been true. I mean, it's true in housing. It's true in the workplace. I mean, there are places that people would rather be, but today, the disparity between places that the performance of buildings in places that people really want to be. I own a little building at the corner of 50th and France in Edina. It's the only commercial real estate I still own. And it has always, right through the recession, been full because people want to be there. And I think that's something to really pay close attention to. There's nothing worse than the blight of a failed commercial district. And when they start to tip, it's really important to figure out, can they be viable, or do they need to be something else? And the community, certainly as a real estate investor, much better off figuring out how to help people get where they want to go than we are trying to convince them where they ought to be. It's taken me 35 years to figure that out. But
Joni, you must see some of that. You mentioned your work in Stillwater. I can't think of that when you say authentic places, that would be one that comes to mind for me. Do you agree with that notion that
Absolutely.
people are seeking that out?
People are, yeah. I mean, there's so many things that kind of go back to, one of the questions I'll be coming up with later, but, people really, if you're talking about millennials, they're really looking for an experience. I mean, versus materials, they want experience, and they want these social opportunities, and that happens in these places. And the idea of authenticity, having some of these old buildings still read as their grittiness is appealing to people. It has a history, it has a place versus, trying to create, let's use Block E, was a phenomenal failure because it tried to pretend to be something that it really wasn't. And you can see it off, immediately, so, trying to think about some of the buildings that you have in your community now, how can you kind of still retain That, you know, okay, this was an industrial site. How do we adaptively reuse that and still kind of feel some of its history?
You know, another opportunity I see that has been challenging, but having, you know, the magic of starting to mix primary uses, and we're doing this in places where we never thought we would. I mean, you know, look at all the apartments that are being built in the parking lots of regional malls. Who wants to live in a parking lot of a regional mall? But
A lot of people do, yes.
you know, there's we see this in downtown and in the suburbs, that having more people in a place at more hours of the day is really a valuable thing. And, you know, one of the things that I run into very often is, well, you know, we don't want that here because we don't want so many people around in the evening. Well, you know what, that's what drives problems out, is having the right kind of activity happening. And so there will be, you know, some of your best located land is most likely in properties that, some of which are going to be in a declining productivity, and those are opportunities. We want to figure out how to introduce the kinds of housing in particular, but hospitality, you know, entertainment, civic uses, things that are going to have people in those places more.
If I'm sorry, can I go one more time?
You
on that?
betcha.
So then jumping back to Stillwater, the main move we put in there was to shut down a street completely. The street between Main Street and the lift bridge. It's going to become a pedestrian mall. And it's going to be a program space where people can hang out. It's a great connection between the river, that wonderful resource, and that retail Main Street. Once again, it's trying to create that vitality. It's, you know, the whole idea with Stillwater was that they had this Main Street that was completely congested of traffic. So now the opportunity was, okay, all that traffic's going away. How does the community reclaim their downtown, and how do they revitalize it for pedestrians? That was the big move.
Yeah, go ahead.
Have any of you seen cities change policies? Like the one I'm thinking of, as retail changes, the need for parking is obviously going to change. So you're going to have these available, developable parcels, so to speak, in these big, vast parking lots. And I'm curious if you're seeing cities do that, or if that's still not on the radar yet.
Only
or
the successful ones. I mean, you'll be challenged, I mean, big time, because, you know, these are things that most of us, you know, don't read plans well, and change is stressful in a community. I was in kind of a late night in the city last night that was dealing with, you know, a very meaningful increase in density in a successful commercial district, and, you know, there's issues of high density traffic. So, who's going to show up? But if you know, I challenge you to step back and think about the places you love. They're full of people. It takes traffic to support all that activity, and in many cases, the way we achieve density is by going up.
So nobody goes there anymore, it's too crowded.
Yeah.
You know, what you're talking about, you know, I think you see really, excuse me, big time examples of that on Southdale, and I think Ridgedale as well, but Southdale now has what, a couple of apartment buildings that are on the parking lot, what used to be the parking lot of Southdale. And Ridgedale, I think, has the same thing going on. So there's lots of examples of that happening around the region right now.
And I would even say parking requirements are much more flexible. And in some cases, and John and others may attest to this, is that the cities are wanting less parking, and the market is demanding more parking because of the financing. But cities are becoming more flexible in what they're requiring for parking and changing their policies related to that.
do you see the financing market? I assume they have like their check marks, and for you to get financing, you got to meet all this. with the changing market, I would anticipate they need to, are they gonna be laggards in that process, or are they gonna be able to adapt and keep up with that?